Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Thanatology Themes. This is where the study of death, dying, and bereavement is brought in with real life experience with our guests. And today I'm thrilled that we have Dr. Jillian Blueford. Before I introduce her, I want to just introduce myself, Carolyn, your host, therapist and thanatologist. And I would like to introduce our theme today from Thanatology. Here's our handbook of thanatology here. So Jillian is going to be speaking about a culturally sustaining approach to diagnosing prolonged grief disorder. I just wanted to talk and tie it in with our idea from thanatology. So just a little brief information here. It was actually in 1917 Freud, who we don't use all of his ideas, we've evolved, but he did write a paper about mourning and melancholia. And they use the word mourning, but it's really grieving. And he observed there's this natural process after loss, and then melancholia or kind of depression had derailers or blockers that kind of stopped people from this process. So even in 1917, he observed that. Jumping to 1993, researchers started using the term pathological grief. Then in 95, they started complicated grief. Then they called it traumatic grief, even though it wasn't traumatic, it was severe. So they switched it back to complicated grief. Now we know that I'm looking at my notes here, the American Psychiatric Association uses the term persistent complex bereavement disorder. And as a lot of people know, and I'm going to point here, in our DSM-5 TR, which I believe came out in May of 2021, I think that's right, we actually have the diagnosis of prolonged grief disorder after kind of all of this history. So I just wanted to give a little background. And that now I'm going to introduce Jillian. Okay, so here you have an impressive bio here, Jillian. I'm really excited. Jillian Blueford earned her PhD from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville in counselor education. She currently works as a clinical assistant professor and practicum internship specialist at the University of Denver. Woohoo! And she commonly teaches fieldwork courses and educational strategies and policies. Her scholarly expertise aligns with enhancing grief counseling training, awesome, identifying culturally appropriate approaches to child and adolescent grief, and educating on trauma-informed grief counseling. All really great. Dr. Blueford is also a practicing clinician in the Denver area at a private practice. She currently serves as a board member for the Association of Death Education and Counseling, which I talk about, and I'm actually going to do a full podcast on. So yay. And she's an expert contributor for help texts. And more professional information and opportunities to connect with her can be found on her website, www.jillianblueford.com, and I will add that information onto the podcast so people
Perfect.
can find you and reach out to you. So
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Yeah. Love again talking about this topic and so thrilled that you have a platform to discuss thanatology.
Yeah. Well, I was going to jump in, but is there anything, I just kind of talked a lot. Was there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, yeah. It was nice to hear, your brief kind of like history recap, and how far we have come along in just understanding grief. And there's always the age-old question of like, when is grief problematic? And when is grief just is hard and we struggle through with it, depending on our losses and a whole bunch of other factors. And yeah, there's been a lot of back and forth about you know, pathologizing grief and should we do it? Should we not? What are the implications of that? And culture is definitely a huge part of that as well. And understanding one's cultural context before we, deem that maybe their grief is a little more atypical than we expect.
Yeah. So thank you for bringing that in. And I might jump in a few times. I worked in hospice for 8 years, and
Mm.
even during, not even, but during that process, people have different reactions,
Yeah.
very similar, of course, to after the person had died.
Sure.
So this is also an important piece, our hospice workers understanding and making space for that at that time too, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, but we're going to focus on the culturally sustaining approach to diagnosing prolonged grief disorder. Also, I forgot to show the book, so I do want to just add this. Jillian co-wrote the second chapter in. So this is from the Hospice Foundation of America's Living with Grief series, and this is Understanding Prolonged Grief Disorder, and you co-wrote chapter 2.
Yeah.
Wanted to add that in for our folks out there. Well, do you want to start with I went through the chapter, and one of the first things you kind of talked about were diagnostic considerations.
Mhm.
Do you want to jump in, or would you like me to read? You had two quotes that I thought were really helpful.
Yeah, you're welcome to share the quotes, and yeah, we can talk more.
The two that I thought were really important, without having a cultural understanding of a griever prior to diagnosis, clinicians increase the risk of minimizing a person's experiences and potentially causing unintentional harm and misdiagnosing.
Yeah, for sure. And when I reread that, I think about so my clinical and research experiences, we sometimes we're forced to kind of make decisions about diagnosing quickly. And while we understand that grief is universal and, nearly everyone will experience a loss and therefore some version of a grieving process, um, it's not the same for everyone, right? And if we just look at every client or patient or student that we're encountering and thinking about, well, okay, here's what I know about grief. And so do you fit into this mold or not? Then yeah, we are running the risk of either misdiagnosing, because we know that grief can often be confused with anxiety or depression or PTSD, or just other mental health concerns. And we are maybe quick to say, well, yep, it's problematic because you're not following these prescribed kind of what we think is common responses. And so, having someone's cultural background in mind, not only how they view their identities presently, but like, what does their culture tell them about grief and how to express their grief and how to try to conceptualize their losses, who to seek support from, right? Whether that's family unit, community, or professional services, or maybe we don't reach out to professional services and we kind of keep our stuff, within house. If we don't have all of that in mind, then we run a huge risk of minimizing their experiences, of pushing them away, of, maybe if this was their first attempt to seek out some personal or professional services, and, we quickly minimize and say, well, there's something wrong with you, right? In like your culture and your upbringing, then yeah, we're going to turn them away from seeking that type of support again. Or if we're quick to diagnose and say, yep, this is prolonged grief disorder through and through, without really trying to build that connection, then yeah, we're going to potentially cause more harm than they're already experiencing. And so, yeah, it's just crucial to like, in any part of the therapeutic process, to consider one's culture, but especially in assessment, diagnosing, making some, big decisions that's going to impact someone's, future.
Yeah, no, thank you. That is really important. And I'm going to read the other part that I also thought was really helpful. There Moore and colleagues, I believe you referenced, described common grief responses for Black Americans, including continuing a spiritual connection with a loved one after death, and even rejoicing in their passing, as they believe that their spiritual journey is more positive after death. Lee and Priggerson have found that responses from Chinese grievers, I have experience with that, can commonly include hallucinations, severe distress, especially if trauma was part of the death experience.
Right.
And there's something beautiful about they believe their spiritual journey is more positive. I mean, that's Please talk
Sure.
about that.
Yeah, yeah. And what I took away from when I was reading their scholarship and just others, and when I think about again how we grieve and how much religion, spiritual beliefs, and practices can play a huge influence in our grieving process, especially when it's a death-related loss. You know, this idea that a lot of practices have is, you know, there's expected suffering while we're living, there's expected hardship, right? There's, you know, trials and tribulations that we will encounter, and it will all be worth it once we cross over, right, into whatever our afterlife looks like for us. And it will be, you know, peace that we can't even begin to believe and or even describe while living, and that how that can be comforting for those who are grieving that loss, and you know, because it can bring some type of comfort and knowing that, you know, maybe they're reunited with someone else, other loved ones, family members, friends, maybe any hardships that they were experiencing they no longer are. And while that, you know, doesn't minimize any pain that they may be having while they're grieving, it's, you know, this it's and both, right? Like I can still want this person back in here, and I miss them and I yearn for them, and I am rejoicing that, you know, whatever ailments that they were dealing with, they no longer are, and again, having that peace and level of fulfillment and happiness, right, is what I want for them, right? Even if that means that they are no longer physically with me.
Yeah. And you know, what comes up for me is that, you know, it would be, of course, harmful for a clinician to pathologize that. And what came up when you were talking is strength-based perspective. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
this is a strength-based, not a I mean, those are obviously literally the opposite, right?
Sure, yeah. And again, we're not taking the time to know that, like, oh, that's bringing you comfort, and that's helping, that's a supportive, you know, coping strategy for you, right? But yeah, it could be, you know, we think of grief, you know, we think that someone has to be sad and wants them back, and, you know, all the like negative emotions that we tend to assign to grief. And so if someone is having, you know, moments of feeling rejoice or relief, right, then yeah, we, you know, our flags start to peak up because we think that something is wrong, when again, that can be connected to their spiritual beliefs. Maybe they still feel spiritually connected to that person, right, that, you know, supersedes any physical connection that they had with that person, but that takes time to say, oh, okay, now I get the context of why you're feeling this way, what you're thinking about, how it connects to your culture and community. And so this really is, you know, progress in your grieving process.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, anything else about that before we move on to another topic?
Yeah, just thinking about, you know, the assessments that are used. So now that, you know, DSM-5 text revision has formalized this, and this already had been, you know, back when we really were referring to complicated grief and other terms, you know, assessments and measures that were coming out to try to provide some type of objective view to it, although, you know, grief is incredibly subjective and personal. And I want to just emphasize that, like, even those assessments should be culturally relevant, right, culturally sensitive, because if we're creating one assessment with just one group of people in mind, then, you know, naturally anyone who doesn't fit that certain demographic is going to hit all the check marks that, okay, so maybe you do have it, or something is wrong, or we are, you know, we need to pathologize it, when really it was the measure itself, like the assessment, that was the problem. So when, you know, as clinicians or scholars, if we're developing assessments or utilizing assessments, like being really clear of the questions that we're asking, are we getting to, again, their cultural background and context? Are we allowing conversations about that before we're just giving out, you know, a quantitative measure and making, again, big decisions off of one measure?
Yeah, and I mean, just having a little, I'm going to add a little holistic, I think one of the things is we want our clients to see, we want to see how they're coping. And if this helps them cope, and it, like I was saying, it's kind of a strengths-based perspective. Who are we to say that's not working or they shouldn't, like, oh, this,
Yeah.
and I know that's not as much of a diagnostic, but it is our overall goal is we want you to cope as well as possible. Well, this helps you cope or you're coping. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you're right. I mean, we're not using a formal assessment. We're still going to have informal assessments of how we think that you're thriving, your daily functioning, all those things. And you're right. Like, who am I to say that your way of coping, it wouldn't be maybe my experience, but is it allowing you to still connect with others, to, keep your job, to maintain your other responsibilities, to care for other people, right? Like I try to emphasize with clients that, one, there's no manual for this, right? And, we want to think of, sometimes we want to categorize stuff as the right or wrong way of how to grieve or the right or wrong way of how to do things. And it's way more complicated than that. And some things, are working and are healthy and, adaptive until they're not. And then what happens when they're no longer helping, right? Or it does turn problematic. Okay, well, then we can address that then. But you're right, like having the openness to what is working for you, right? Before I try to impart all the things that I think you should be doing that's going to work.
Mhm. And I mean, I think this was the idea of, which I thought, like I said, was really beautiful of like rejoicing or, this was a positive coping for people. So,
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Um, so maybe we can move on to one thing, you had written, and it's so important and it's a really hard, so you mentioned neurological differences and intellectual disabilities. Um, when I worked in hospice, we really struggled with trying to work with a family member, a caregiver. I'm going to say we weren't even that successful. I'm going to admit it. I don't know. Any insights on that?
Yeah. Yeah. And you're right. I mean, again, our typical way of trying to support someone who's grieving usually comes with the assumption that they that we are assuming they understand some aspects of the loss. And again, that will depend on, development, the age of the person, things like that. And it's important, one, to not carry the assumption that oh, if they do have any neurological differences, any intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities, that means that they're not able to grieve, right, or understand some aspects of the loss. And so if we kind of remove that preconceived or bias or assumption, then we can approach it just like anyone else, right? Anytime I meet with any client, regardless of their neurotypical, just neural abilities, I want to hear from them. How are they defining this loss, right? What was actually their loss, right? And other things that have come up after that. And then we can talk about, well, how are they trying to manage their day to day? And for some, if they are autistic, or just need more concrete, conversations and explanations. Okay, well then I can tailor it, right? Because again, grief, loss, mortality, all those things are very existential at times and can get very abstract very quickly. But for those that, I need to bring it back down to here, I had this and now I don't have this anymore. And so I'm defining that as a loss and a stressor for me. And so maybe, again, my idea of coping skills needs to be revisited. I need to think about maybe there will be more repetition in the loss and just conversations, right? And that's okay too. How do I tell if the person is feeling overwhelmed, right? Just like, again, I would do with any client, and then scale it back some, right? Do we need to take breaks, right? Do we need to incorporate, again, just like with any other client, arts, something to do with their hands, right? Movement, if that's possible, right? So it doesn't feel like an intense talk therapy session. And so, you know, it's working with that person to see what they need, right? And building that relationship, building that rapport. And yeah, it is challenging because we know that there can be another layer. It's not impossible, right? We know, again, they're still grieving, they still experience the loss just like anybody else. And, you know, maybe need even more supports because they may be written off as grievers, right? Or you don't fully understand. And so therefore, you know, I'm not going to maybe explain as much or check in as much, right? That we typically do with other disenfranchised grievers. But yeah, that's kind of, you know, I try not to approach it too differently because just like I'm meeting with someone for the first time, I have no idea of their background. And again, I want to take the time to learn their cultural identities and how they show up in spaces. And then I can maybe pull in other resources to say, okay, how can I better serve and engage with this person based off of their way of comprehending the world.
I think that's really helpful. I think, I mean, I'm going to speak for myself. I think that sometimes clinicians feel they're going to say, even though we might have experience with grief or with kids, we feel like we don't know what to say sometimes if someone, and I think I hear what you're saying. You're like, okay, well, we're going to use our tools that we already have, right?
Yeah. We're going to use our tools. We're going to, if we do find ourselves like, this really kind of is getting out of my scope, right? My competence, we're going to go to our professional development, right? We're going to, you know, there's tons of literature about working with individuals of all, you know, learning styles, disabilities, abilities. You know, this is not a new concept to the grieving world. And so, you know, it's okay to recognize like, this is new to me, right? Just like it may be new to my client. And so who do I need to consult with? What other information do I need to learn on my end? And then still allow for that person to make this space what they need it to be.
And you're so right on about either incorporating some sort of either art therapy or
Sure.
that's always a, you know, or even sometimes maybe going into the body or a little bit of somatic work might be helpful.
Yeah, music, right? And again, you know, these are tools that I may implement with anyone, but definitely for those, they can just need like me forcing you to talk about your grief and your feelings, like it isn't aligning with them, right? And so, okay, I can be flexible. Right?
Yeah. So you touched on the word disenfranchised. And I want to talk about that for a second.
Yes.
I am going to point to our Ken Doka book here.
Yeah.
Death and Dying, Life and Living. So in 2022, he defined disenfranchised grief. I'll read the definition. Maybe we'll talk just for a second about a person's experience when they incur a loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, or publicly mourned. Yeah. And yeah, do you want to expand on that for a minute?
Yeah, because when I think about a lot of times I think about disenfranchised grief and grievers and how much a lot of that, you know, not able to express their grief or it doesn't feel like it's, you know, accepted within society, like how much also that is based off of cultural identities and world events. And whether that's, you know, a lot of times I think there's, you know, common examples, right? If someone dies by suicide or homicide, sometimes even like military, individuals can, like their families can feel disenfranchised based off how we feel about war at that time and, what we're engaged in. And those, I think about the AIDS epidemic, right? Even with COVID, right? When people who were dying for things that are unrelated to COVID, that was always kind of the first question, right? Like, was it COVID related? And then if it was, well, was the person vaccinated? Right? Like we're already trying to find ways to be, well, maybe they caused this, right? That's already ostracizing that person's family and friends and community who are just trying to grapple with, someone that died maybe suddenly, right, and unexpectedly.
Mhm.
And again, how much of that is to, you know, our culture and what our cultural context and communities tell us about how to express our grief. Again, where does religion and spiritual practices come in about the manner of our death and whether that feels acceptable or not. So if it wasn't acceptable, then now I have, my community, my religious community that doesn't feel welcoming anymore. And so it definitely can, hinder obviously our grieving process. And I don't know how much that comes up in our assessment for prolonged grief disorder, right? Like how much of this, does your grief feel like it's a struggle because as a society, we're just not allowing you to talk about it and express. And so now, you feel like you're holding it in and your typical coping skills you can't do because you can't go to your support networks or you can't share it with someone else. And you're trying to figure out how to do this all by yourself, which is causing you to feel isolated and, maybe withdrawn from others, like all the kind of criteria that comes up for this disorder. But how much of that is just systemic, right? And again, are we accounting for that? Like, oh, well, maybe if you did feel more accepted in your grief and your loss, then you wouldn't be experiencing the other things that you are because you actually have the space to heal.
That is a really important point. You're right. There could be people who really don't, meet these criteria for prolonged grief disorder. They've been disenfranchised in their
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And, kids, right. Going those to, do you have any intellectual disabilities?
Mhm.
You know, can often, again, be overlooked as grievers. And so therefore we're not checking in on them as much, providing supports. And then when we see other behaviors that feel problematic, then we want to connect the dots to like, oh, well, maybe it is prolonged or maybe they are struggling when it's like could we have been more preventative and
Mhm.
proactive from the beginning?
Yeah. When you were describing it, also the word that came up for me was judgment. It feels like, yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
just, what people are kind of judging, like you said, how the person died or, why they died or did, uh,
Right.
so that idea of we want to, I mean, of course, as clinicians, we don't judge, right? We want to make space and yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And yeah. A lot of the disenfranchisement, yeah, it does come from a level of judgment or perceived judgment. So therefore, I'm not even going to share the loss, right? Or perceived shame, right? I think about those if they're struggling with infertility or pregnancy loss, how that, is common and it feels like a siloed experience because maybe folks didn't even know, right? Or again, or, may judge or say unhelpful comments, right? That is not, not helpful in one's grief. But yeah, it's a level of, and as clinicians, you're right, we don't want to have any judgment in our work. And how do we also help folks like knowing like when you leave my office, right, or my virtual space, you may be going back out to that judgment. And so how do we also help support you in that? Because they got to live outside of our sessions as well.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. Sometimes I'll talk with people about, we do the deeper work and then there's the coping, right?
Mm-hmm.
Deeper work in session, but then, like you said, then they have to go, how are they going to cope outside?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, for sure.
that's a good point. Yeah. So the next topic you wrote about is really important. It's also a big topic, but let's fold it in. Systematic inequities and historical trauma. This could probably be a podcast or a series of podcasts.
Yeah.
Not that I'm joking, but this is such a big topic. You wrote about systematic injustices impact many settings, totally true. Healthcare, higher education, law enforcement, within mental health professions. I'm going to I have a friend who's a social worker in I don't want to get teary-eyed. So I'm in Brooklyn. She's a Spanish speaker. She works with, it's a school where they have a number of migrant children. You know, and you mentioned higher education. I'm getting upset. These are like preschoolers and like little kids, you know. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, is there something, you know,
Yeah, you're right. Like it's and it's such a piece that I just want folks to remember and think about, because if you're meeting with someone individually, like it can be easy just to focus on what they're presenting with, what they're bringing in. And if I tend to, in my just clinical work and just I think in life, think in systems, right? We are interacting in so many systems all the time, and some of them are helpful, some of them are loaded with inequities and, again, historical events and decisions and laws and policies that we know nothing about but are impacting our day-to-day, and potential to seek support, to grieve in the way that we need to, and for some, they're in systems where it's loss after loss after loss, potential traumatic events, crises, and that's a tough system to thrive in, right? Let alone potentially survive in. And so when we are thinking about, again, prolonged grief disorder, right? If you're especially working with kids or just young adults, like, are we thinking about their older generations, right? And especially if they, did migrate to this country, or there was forced migration to this country, or forced resettlement, or genocide, or all the things like that. Maybe that's not impacting, the young adult that you are maybe, providing services to, but it's embedded within them, right? Because it's embedded within their family unit, within their systems, within their communities. And that grief, just like we emphasize that, like, grief doesn't have a timeline, right? And, grief may not ever go away, right? That's same for historical trauma, generational loss, like that grief is still there, right? And a lot of times is passed down to different generations, and whether it's discussion about the loss itself, is we have this loss because of this, like, systemic inequity, right? Or something happened within the medical profession, or, again, legal system. And so while the one person may not know much about the loss, they know about the behavior shifts and the mindset and the relationships, or the tense relationships now that a lot of communities have with just other professions, including, again, mental health professions. And so they know that piece, right? They may not have the historical context, but they know, they're like, I've always received the message to, like, not really share a lot, don't trust authorities. The legal system is not here to protect me or, serve any justice for me, right? Again, they may not have any real context of why they received that message. They just know they received that message from people that they trust, and so they're going to go with it. Right. And that as they get older, like, we realize, like, oh, that's not how things should be. And that's a loss within itself. Right. If I know that certain groups of people can benefit from certain systems and I can't, and there's nothing that I did to deserve that, right? Or nothing that they did to deserve that, then that's a loss too. Right. Because now I know I'm missing out on, extra supports, some guidance, right? Opportunities, right? Because of so many things that have happened in the past and that continue to happen, quite honestly. But now I see the inequities, right? And sometimes we forget there's a loss in that as well. And again, I don't know if all of the assessments, and informal or formal, really try to capture that. They're like, oh, now I get why, like, your response to this loss seems to be over the top or maybe more extreme than what I would be expecting. But it's not just this loss, right? It's like a whole other thing, like set of things and circumstances and events and messaging that are influencing how you are responding to the one loss that you told me about. And so, yeah, it's a lot to keep in mind, but, like, it's important to keep those things in mind.
I mean, that actually connects to, which I do want to go into in a minute, the cultural identities and history of losses, generational impact, and how we can work some of these things into our assessment, right?
Right.
that was, yeah, really, when I read that, I'm like, wow, this is going to change the way I do my assessments. Because
Mm-hmm.
like you said, we try to keep this in mind of, a lot of us clinicians. I think though, to really ask the questions or really have the conversation, even if it's in that kind of initial visit with, oh yeah, this is, I'm getting a picture of this, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of our like intake initial processes, yeah, we do try to inquire about family units, family dynamics, whether, those relationships are supportive, or maybe that's the reason that they're seeking counseling. And yeah, we try to get some idea of, and especially if for those who, there are certain theoretical frameworks like have us going into the past, right? Then yeah, definitely we're going to bring some of that things up. But are we also talking about historical trauma, generational trauma, right? When we get into, why this is how I grieve, this is how I know to understand loss, I grew up in a household that like didn't talk about any losses at all. We kind of just went on as things were normal and you just had to be tough. Okay, well, where did we think that was stemming from? Right. And does that even go back further than just your immediate household, right? And how you grew up. Um, but yeah, it's just in a couple different questions. And maybe the person's like, I've never even thought about this, right? Or, I don't know if I've had those conversations with older caregivers in my life, or maybe they're not around,
Yeah.
right? To share and to pass that stuff down. And again, there's loss in that as well, of cultural and language and stories, right? Good or bad, that a lot of people are have missed as well. And so therefore, I have no idea of how I came to be in this way. And and so now I feel like it's just me. Like there's something wrong with me because I'm operating in this way, I'm grieving in this way. When it's like, really, maybe again, that was historical things that you just know nothing about, that someone isn't around to tell you.
Yeah, yeah. So you can, maybe we'll jump to that. And I'm gonna read a couple things from your book, and
Yeah.
then I do want to go back to the clinician's role, but I think we're kind of talking about something here that I really, there were just a couple points I thought were really great. And you did just kind of mention, with cultural identities, what were the messages you received growing up about loss? I thought that was great.
Mhm.
About expressing your grief. Do you feel pressured to express your grief in a certain way? I have
Mhm.
also, I've worked with some first generation, and I work with sometimes younger people, and mom and dad were from in their home country. And sometimes there's a dissonance, I think is the word, between the kid who, I mean, they're in their whatever, but like they grew up here, they feel American, and mom and dad have very different cultural, yeah, practices.
Sure. Yes. And that makes me think about currently a colleague of mine, Dr. Charmaine Adams, and we just finished up some data collection for a study on trauma-informed grief counseling with older Black adults. And we were looking at, their current stressors and losses, but also their losses across the lifespan and trauma across the lifespan. And yeah, like what were the messages, and similar, many of them that again were, they're in their 60s or 70s. They view just expressing emotions and seeking out support and letting others know, when you're struggling, like that's kind of their approach now. But that was very different than what they were taught by their parents, grandparents, older siblings, right? Again, this mentality of keeping things strong, solely relying on your religion, even if things are strong, like, or not great. That's the only, source of support that you need. Don't talk about it, right? And how they had to really kind of work to shift away from that, because they realized it wasn't helping them, right? And so now they talked about, like, for their kids and grandkids,
Right.
how they're trying to help, transform some of the things that they have learned so they don't pass down potential harmful messages or narratives.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, yeah, people evolving and want to make a change, but it's those differences. So that I thought was a great There were so many that were good. Oh, you had mentioned this. Who did your family turn to when facing difficulties? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, yeah. Um, and these two, I thought, well, I'm going to skip around, but are there any salient community losses that still affect you? You did mention that. I thought that was really just it kind of opened my mind. I thought that was a really good question. Um, I don't know if you want to expand on that. I was just like, wow,
Yeah.
that's a
Because
really,
and depending on again the person's cultural identities and upbringings, like community can feel just as equal to my like immediate family unit, right? And so maybe their first losses were family friends down the road that they consider to be an aunt, right, or a grandmother, or maybe parents of their friends, right, if there was a loss, or again something that happens where if it was an external force like law enforcement or medical professionals or other things that impacted the community, again that's a loss as well. And as we continue to evolve, like the idea of community neighborhoods in some areas have shifted, right, compared to folks that were like, yeah, I was really close within my community, everyone knew everyone, right, we knew the houses we can go to, and we knew that those parents, if they didn't like with how we were behaving, they could respond in the same way as our parents could. And again, some of that is, a lot of that is still there, and some of that has also just disappeared. But it there that sense of oh, I have others that are outside of my family that I consider family. The idea of like chosen family, right? That yeah, if there was losses within that, right, or if someone moved unexpectedly, right, then yeah, those are going to also be just as prevalent as again their primary losses or other losses within that family household.
and you also, this does touch upon community, I do think can look different to different people.
Sure.
And I know there's a comedian who made a joke about this, and I forget what their ethnicity was, but they were like, everyone's your cousin and everyone's your uncle, but they grew, and but I know that there are some, and certainly here in Brooklyn, there's still communities like that where you're really close and you're maybe not even related, but you call them your uncle or your cousin, or
Right.
which is again a strengths-based perspective. And not there, we need to recognize that, right?
Mm-hmm,
What
mm-hmm.
does community even mean to different, or what does family mean is different to different
Right.
people.
Right. Yeah, and again, sometimes it can be the relationships with the aunt that's not really an aunt, right, or the cousins that's not biologically related. Those relationships can be more substantial than because they really connected with me. Maybe they were close to me in age,
Mhm.
and so that loss hit harder,
Yeah.
right, than other losses they have experienced.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I really liked this one. Again, I'm big on how people are coping for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
How has this loss affected your career goals and passions?
Mm-hmm.
I really like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And I think when we think about that, especially, because while I haven't worked in hospice for any length of period of time, I like when I was a master's student, my practicum and internship was at a hospice bereavement center. That's kind of my first introduction to grief counseling. And, you know, we think about uh, folks who had to make some changes in their careers, put things on hold, right, if they had to become a caregiver for any period of time, and how there was some loss in that too. And and now that the person that you were caring for is no longer living, that shift back to like, well, who, this was my identity for a really long time, and now this isn't. And so yeah, what does this look like to pick back up of what I put down for a little bit? And I've seen that in other capacities where someone, if they move back home, right? If they, maybe they were at the point of making some career decisions and then a loss happened. And so they just couldn't even focus on pursuing post-secondary education or a career choice. Maybe they turn down, opportunities to move abroad, whatever it may be. The recognizing the loss within that. And while, I've had tons of clients that, I would do that again, right? Especially if I knew that I was taking care of someone that was dying, right? I won't get that time back. And now I feel like I'm behind. Yeah. And, I don't hold resentment, right, towards anyone. But now it's, am I still in the right path, right? Or how many times, as I've worked with folks that they kind of thought this was their path and life goals and career goals, and then something happened and they're like, well, wait, like, does that still matter to me? Right? Is that still important to me? Or do I want to go into another direction as well? So yeah, considering, again, thinking of that holistic person, right? And how much time that we spend working, right? Thinking about careers, making career changes and moves, going back to school, doing all those things take up a good portion of our time. And a good portion of our identity that's also rooted in our cultural identities as well.
And I'm going to say, I think this touches on secondary losses.
Yes.
And also understanding a secondary loss, what that means to the person culturally or within their, we have to recognize or kind of respect for them that this secondary loss is very real and important.
Yes. Yeah. And again, it's not usually a terminology that just average day folks who are grieving will know about, but then you kind of get into, okay, maybe this lot, it became a domino effect. So yeah, I changed careers, I moved, right? I left kind of my core group of supportive people. And now, that also, maybe I ended a relationship, right? And now all those things are impacting me. But sometimes they don't see that as losses. Yeah. They just see that as necessary changes. I had to do what I had to do. And yes, and those are still losses that are pretty impactful.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things we can kind of help people with is sometimes giving them the language also is yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I wanted to jump down to, I'm holding the book, reading from the book here.
Yeah.
The History of Losses and Generational Impact. And there were a couple, again, this one I thought was really helpful. Are there any salient losses in your family lineage that impact you? I love that.
Yeah. And again, it's a different turn on just, again, our typical inquiries about family life and upbringings and dynamics. But again, is there a piece to your family puzzle that's missing? And so therefore that person that also, again, carried stories, context, language, traditions, rituals, right? That, a lot of family units try to pass down in some way. If we have a break in that, then, that means only so much, right, can be passed down. Or if there was any damage, to material things that often get passed down, right? Jewelry, pictures, right? Recipes, a lot of the clothing, right? That could help with, again, keeping that family lineage going that now is gone, right? And so, yeah, that's, again, just another take on and maybe the person can't answer that question right then, but it's going to be food for thought for them.
Yeah. I really thought that was a powerful question. And I also really liked this one. Reflect silently on any traumatic experiences you have endured in your lifetime without the need to share details unless you want to. How did or do you cope? I thought that was really helpful. Yeah. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, part of it is, having that trauma-informed, trauma-invested lens means that I don't need to know the nuances of any traumatic experiences to then change my approach in sessions, right? I tend to work under the impression that, most, if not all of us have had some type of traumatic experience, and whether we use that that terminology to explain that or not is up to the person. But, you know, having to reshare the story in order to get to, well, how have you processed that? How do you continue to process that? Like, it's just not needed, right? Because you know, we're risking re-traumatizing them just for the sake of answering a question about coping skills. And so, and again, you know, I've had some clients that maybe never thought of it as a trauma, because if it happens so often, it felt like, this doesn't feel like this should be happening, but this feels like my norm. And so I don't know if I would call it traumatic. It was just here's how I grew up, right? And some we categorize some events as traumatic and some as not. And again, you know, that's all perceptual and subjective, right? I'm not going to force anyone to accept something as traumatic. Just like, you know, saying we talked about coping skills, like what's working for you. If it's working for you, is working for you, right? If you don't want to identify this as traumatic and that's working for you, I'm not gonna make you say it was traumatic, right? I can still recognize and we can still honor the challenges of that experience, right, without having to label it per se. But yeah, having that moment to like, let's impart some silence in our session, right? Especially if we're going through all these questions and talking about losses, it's a lot. And so how do we just have a pause? And you think about some other things that maybe you'll share, right? Maybe you won't, right? That's on you, and that's your autonomy and your right. But I am curious about how you've handled those stressors with your losses, right? Because like you said, not all loss is traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Mm-hmm. But is there any similarities between the two?
Yeah. I'm a big, I begin all my sessions with us taking a breath together, and I try to do pause and
yeah, it's a lot to have to share. And if someone has, you know, gone through maybe meeting with different therapists or clinicians, right, trying to find kind of that right connection, or again, thinking about systems and inequities, and if insurance is involved or they were receiving services that maybe were free or on a sliding scale, but then that ran out, so they have to go to someone else, and like you got to call, right, maybe do some consultation, complete a bunch of paperwork, right, doing that over and over again, like is exhausting. And then to have to share all of your losses, all of your trauma, right, in that first 1 or 2 sessions is also exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. So I thought maybe we could move into, which I thought all of the ones that you wrote were really helpful. Like I said, transformative. But I did want to touch on the clinician's role. So you had written, when considering a diagnosis of prolonged grief disorder, clinicians must consider culturally sustaining practices they can implement from the beginning of the therapeutic process. And you had mentioned administering culturally sensitive assessments, which I think I'm going to ask you, to maybe talk about. And then the potential implication. Oh, this is interesting. The potential implications for clients once a diagnosis has been made, validation, stigma, confidentiality, all of these kinds of things.
Yeah. And so for the assessment piece, and again, whether you're using a formal assessment or informal, right? Again, how are you always thinking through a cultural lens? And even if, you know, you're working with a client that you don't share similar cultural identities, right? What's your level of cultural humility, right? What's the work you're doing on your end, right? To learn about one's culture, and then giving them the space to say, like, okay, this is maybe what I learned somewhere, and this is like my reality, and here's what I'm actually experiencing. And, you know, as a clinician, are we okay with being wrong, right, or having assumptions that are not correct, all those things. And then talking to a client, even before, you know, even if they actually do meet all the criteria for prolonged grief disorder and it makes the most sense, and, you know, it feels like, okay, a diagnosis can be beneficial to them. How are you explaining that process? A lot of times, again, we kind of pick our things afterwards. We're writing our notes. We're, you know, submitting claims, all this stuff. but are we having a honest conversation with clients about the pros and cons of any diagnosis, right? Why we have diagnosing in the first place, and here's why. Here's based off of, and you can bring out the text, right? Like, it doesn't have to be a hidden thing that only clinicians and other mental health professionals know about. Like, here's what I'm basing it on, right? Or here's how I'm selecting assessments that are including the criteria of this. And you help me decide like what aligns, right? What doesn't. And if, we do proceed with this diagnosis, yeah, again, here, it could be validating, right? To know that, oh, something's not wrong with me.
Yeah.
Right. It could feel like, oh man, now I have a diagnosis, like I have that label. And especially if someone is, if they have other diagnoses, right? It may not, validation could be there, it may not be, right? And then so now what do we do with it? And I think that's the most important part to stress. I think about if we are, have a cold or of the flu or something, we'll go, or even COVID, like we'll go get tested, but they're all viruses. And so the response may be like, it can be helpful to maybe know, like, all right, so I do have the flu, and maybe, I can share if I was around other people or something. Now I know, but now what, right? Like, what's the course of action? And so you don't, you want to help clients to like not get stuck in just a diagnosing like label, but it's like, and now here, here's what we can do, and here's what we maybe could have done even without the diagnosis. But now, we can understand that, like, there are some extra hiccups in your grieving process, right? That maybe you didn't experience before with other losses, right? Because this loss is just different, or it's a compounding of other losses, or there was a trauma that was involved. And so it's just, you're responding differently to this, right? Because the body can only handle so much. So yeah, you want to like involve folks in that process, right? Especially, if they have no knowledge of the mental health profession, the DSM, right? They don't know what that is compared to any other book out there. You want to explain it in a way that they'll understand, right? And they have some autonomy, right, in this, because oftentimes we experience losses or traumatic events, so there's element of, I lost, I didn't have control over this. If something happened to me, right, I lost something that I didn't want to. Yeah. And so to give some ability of control, autonomy, power back, right, can also be therapeutic.
Absolutely. Well, I thought we could just, one thing we were gonna, before we wrap up, we could talk about, you did mention, I'm gonna read the quote.
Yeah.
And this was towards the end. Although comorbidity is conceivable, clinicians should show caution to not overdiagnose and potentially pathologize grief, right? Prolonged grief disorder is a controversial topic. You said it, it's true. And we need to kind of, or I said it, but as you said, this, is there something you want to add? Or, I mean, this is a big topic. I know a lot of clinicians are talking about it. It's out there.
Sure.
I think we need to give it a little bit of space.
Yeah. And this has been a conversation that's been happening for quite some time, about, the inclusion of prolonged grief disorder. And again, what message does that send, right? About grief, and, is it going to perpetuate the disenfranchised grief and already the stigma that's associated with that a lot of people have with their grief, or just them as grievers, right? Are we making things worse in an effort to try to on paper make things better? And so, there will still continue to be opinions about it. I don't know if it will be removed from the DSM anytime soon. And so while we have it, right, while it's here, doesn't mean like that needs to be our default, right? Again, just because someone's grief doesn't align with how we think grief should be, or how we've personally grieved losses. And we can take this opportunity to really explore that person for who they are, again, considering their cultural identities, their development, right, community upbringings, all the things, careers, all those things, when considering this type of diagnosis, or again, or any diagnosis, right? Because in the DSM, you know, they have for every diagnosis a little caveat that, like, yeah, someone can meet this criteria, but is this still within their scope of cultural identities and like what we expect for like who they are as a person? And sometimes we overlook that because we're like, well, what does that mean, right? And it's, you know, it's almost in every diagnosis, like, is it impacting, right, their day to day, and is it just out of their scope for like what we expect based off, again, who they are? And because that's harder to determine, right? And that requires like getting really a lot of input from that person, right, and understanding their previous losses and like, is this out of the norm for you, right? Or and the timing of the loss, the circumstance, like all those things we got to consider to before we say like, yep, like this is, you know, again, this grief is not serving you well right now, and is causing a lot more disruptions than your grief in the past has. And there can be fruitful benefits to that, right? Again, just having an understanding that like, oh, okay, like there's not something that's inherently wrong with me because I'm having a harder time with this loss than previous losses, right? And, you know, what else could this mean for other supports, right? Could this bring up other diagnosis, maybe, you know, and having conversations about like, yeah, do you feel like this further stigmatizes you, right? Based off your identities, your loss, right? Obviously, you know, a person doesn't have to share any diagnosis with other people, but is there benefit to that, right? Or, you know, keeping it just within yourself, but now it kind of, you know, things maybe make more sense. So yeah, there will always be many that, you know, do not agree with the fact that we have this, especially because, again, we always try to promote that like grief is grief, right? Loss is loss. It happens. And so it's hard to say that, oh, well, this happens and like this is a part of our life journey, and there's still maybe a problem with it, right? You know, I can see how many like are trying to make the argument that like you can't have both, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, you just said so many great sentences, like so many great. And just lastly, you know, I do hear what you're saying. This idea, you know, stigma is something we always we're careful about, and you know, grief is. I do, you know, grief, it feels like had been very stigmatized for a long time. I mean, I think things are changing, but, you know, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, or maybe not in the, but, you know, you didn't use the word cancer, or, you know, kids weren't allowed to see, you know, people, you know, and, you know, get the kids away and we don't, you know, and so it was this very kind of, a siloed thing, or this, you know, and I do think things are changing, but this idea of like even death, dying, grief, all of it seems like, you know, I always try to say like death and dying is actually a part of life, but you know, even our medical community used to, I mean, I hope it's changing, we're separate, right? We're living, and now you're, you know, so, okay, the person died, or you're grieving, or
right.
But so yeah, I think stigma comes from that, right?
Yeah, we definitely want to. Yeah, you're right. I do think there has been a shift. I think the pandemic really caused a lot of people to have that shift, and especially when we saw, you know, our medical professionals grieving, right, and dealing with a ton of things that even if they knew they were working in, you know, the ER department, which already brings a lot of chaos. This, you know, was unparalleled and not, you know, anything that anyone could prepare for. And so, yeah, there, you know, I do think there's some shifts and there's more conversations. I feel like I read more about grief in just in newspapers and other magazine articles more than I ever have. And how do we like almost kind of like spread this conversation to like all professions? Right. So like, we see that, oh yeah, our nurses and our doctors and other folks, like they went through a lot, our mental health professionals, obviously you went through a lot. What about like those in business and marketing, right? Construction, right? How do we, yeah, make it feel like it is a part of life and it is inevitable? And, talking about it doesn't bring it on any faster, right? But yeah, this is still trying to break down that idea that like it's a taboo to talk about, right? And I haven't quite figured out like how to fix that yet, but I hope that yeah we have more conversations about it and again about grief too. There's still a lot of societal expectations for a lot of people to like hold it together, right, and to be the strong one. And I hope for a day where we can let that go too, right? We don't have to be strong all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, the last thing I'll say, so I did work in hospice, and as hospice is symptom management. And when people come to me for grief, it's not something we fix, right?
Right.
I say we integrate it, but can we do some kind of symptom management for you, like, coping, how,
Sure.
you
Sure.
need to have your grief and feel it, and then, how are you coping with it? So, but not from like a stigmatized place, right?
Sure, sure. Yeah, and thinking about again the oftentimes, if we have a diagnosis, typically that means like, oh, there must be a treatment for it, right?
Mhm.
Like, whether it's in the DSM or a medical diagnosis or something, well, hopefully, there's a way to fix it, right? And I think that's also been the argument of like, there's nothing to fix about grief, right? There's nothing wrong
Yeah.
with grief inherently. And so, yeah, how do we help remind people of that too? Like, yeah, it's integrated into who you are, and not something that you necessarily need to push away. Because I often tell people, yeah, you can try to push it away, and it may work for some time, and then it will come back even stronger because it needs that space to be part of you too.
Yeah. Well, thank you. You've been so generous with your time. I didn't know if there was any last thing you wanted to add or say, or something we missed from your
Yeah. No, that I hope that folks check out the text itself. I want to thank my co-author, Dr. Nancy Thacker Darrow. And we've had our conversations a lot about this topic. And so hopefully we continue to have more conversations about this topic. And even, if you are anti prolonged grief disorder, right, that's okay. And how do we still infuse culturally sustaining approaches to all of our sessions, right? Regardless if there's a diagnosis attached to it. And so, yeah, I had a good time.
Absolutely. No, that's a great thing. Yes, we need to do in all our sessions. Thank
Yeah.
you so much, Jillian. I really, like I said, you've been so generous with your time, and I
Sure.
really appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for listening to Thanatology Themes.